How did you conduct your research for this book?
My research for the book sort of spanned a couple of different ways. Primarily, I spent a lot of time in Pakistan, a few years actually on the ground in Pakistan, living in Pakistan, being there for elections, whether it was local or national elections, and doing surveys in terms of looking at voters' behavior, perceptions, views towards some of these political parties. Did a number of focus groups with different select targeted audiences to get a sense of developing some of these hypotheses, to try to get a sense of what are people viewing on the ground. And one thing is that when you do, I think, focus groups and surveys in Pakistan, you realize that they interpret things maybe very differently. And so even what we might consider to be religious, they may not be considered religious, or something we consider to be fairly benign, they may view it as that's an Islamic party. So it helped refine my idea of how people viewed these political organizations, and how they distinguish, for example, between a political organization and a charity organization, and in terms of giving money. And sometimes those lines are blurred in Pakistan. And so, those focus groups and surveys are very helpful. I did a lot of interviews with political leaders from different political parties, again, giving me insight into how these political parties work, the machinery, if there's elections, how are people elected to offices, how do they recruit volunteers that go door to door and canvassing, whether it's in an urban area or a rural area. So the surveys, the focus groups, the interviews are very, very important. And then I did an interesting field experiment, which in some ways was to try to get a better understanding. It's called the dictator game, but it's an interesting example of trying to understand what voters would actually do. It was an action-based indicators to try to get a better sense of how do they, if we could get close to not just what they think, but they might actually do if they're given money or given a small amount of resources. How would they delegate those resources? And so all of these things combined, mixed methods in terms of methodology, help me in terms of getting a better sense of understanding the political landscape in Pakistan. And I think being on the ground really helped, at least for me, to get a better understanding, because I still think of myself as always learning. And every time I go back to Pakistan, I'm learning more about the region, and not just in Pakistan, but in Afghanistan, in India, in Bangladesh, to get a wider perspective of how people view politics in Muslim majority countries.
In the research that you did, was there something that you found extremely surprising? Were you shocked by kind of anything that came up in either the focus groups or your interviews?
Yeah, there was a few things that I found surprising that, it was almost counterintuitive. One thing that jumped out at me when I was able to do my surveys and field experiments was that I thought that political parties on this, so to say, this Sharia secular continuum, if I think that my political party is not going to win, my intuition when I first started this research was that I would vote for the next party closest to my party in ideological views that would win the election. So the analogous situation in the U.S. was that if I'm a Republican, and let's say I'm more of a Tea Party conservative Republican, and let's say I feel that my candidate doesn't have a good chance to win, so I'm going to vote. I'm not going to, quote unquote, throw away my vote. I'm going to vote it for somebody who I think can win, who's at least closer to my ideology. I would vote for another Republican candidate, stay within the party. That was my intuition, and potentially coming from the American mindset. I said that should hold in Pakistan. But what I found out was very different. What I found out was that people are most contentious with political parties that are closer together on that sort of continuum. So if I feel that my vote is going to be wasted voting for this Islamic party, I'm going to vote for a party that is further away from me, because I don't want the party that is closer to my ideological or my platform to win. So the analogous situation would be, again, going back to being a Republican, I would vote for a Democratic candidate over a Republican candidate if I felt that my Tea Party Republican candidate was not going to win. And that was surprising to me, because I felt that in Pakistan, you wouldn't find that type of what we call out-group bias. But that held true in a lot of areas. So again, someone would vote for someone very far along this continuum away from their general preferences if their party, they thought they were going to throw away that vote. So that's one thing that came up that I found fairly surprising in the research. The other thing I found out that jumped out at me was when I was interviewing a lot of political party leaders, some of the Islamic parties had the most rigorous internal democratic procedures. And so their elections to offices, for example, the Jamaat Islami in Pakistan, one of the Islamic parties and one of what I consider Islamist party, they had very rigorous elections for their offices. While a lot of other political parties appoint people almost on a patronage basis, almost on a familial basis, they will appoint people almost dynastically. But some of the parties had very rigorous internal mechanisms for electing party leaders, electing local party district leaders. And that also jumped out at me that a lot of these parties had evolved over time to be quite rigorous in how they ran their political party machinery internally, and how they recruited volunteers, and how they elected their representatives. So those two things really, I think, caught me by some surprise, but it was building on the research of many others that have done work in the region.
You mentioned that you had hoped with your work to be able to dispel some common stereotypes that you confront. So you've mentioned some already in this interview, but I'd be curious, are there any other big ones that kind of jump out to you that you really would love to see kind of done away with?
There's a few different stereotypes that, jump out in terms of dispelling it. And, with my research and the research that I've done by others. I think one stereotype is that all these Islamic parties are sort of monolithic and that they act in a sort of a unitary way. And I think the research shows that there's a lot of different types of Islamic parties and that they are very strategic. Like other political parties, they're pragmatic. And so sometimes they show surprising sort of moderation. And sometimes Islamic parties are making coalitions with secular parties. Oftentimes they're taking positions on issues that may be against their base and when they legislate. And so that's also surprising. So in certain ways you find that certain parties, depending on the issue, will take either a more moderate stance or they may move further to the right to take a stance that we would be surprised by. And some of these Muslim democratic parties that are very middle of the road on their stances, oftentimes they can also show surprising flexibility, moving further to the right to appease a part of their base or to take a certain position on an issue because that might burnish their credentials among the voter bases. And so I almost see these as very strategic actors that are moving along this continuum based on, the current issues. And they don't necessarily hold themselves to just one sort of area. There's sort of surprising flexibility oftentimes. So I think that's an important thing to dispel. The other is that they are learning and they're evolving over time. These are very, in a lot of ways, these are political parties that are evolving as any political organization as they become more national in stature, as they increase their size or increase their voter base, they're changing. And it's important to sort of keep track of how those parties changes. The Jamaat Islami today in Pakistan is very different than the Jamaat Islami 15 years ago. And so these parties, I think, is important to understand how are they changing and how is their changing contributing or not contributing to the emerging democracies we find in Pakistan. I think the other thing is that we oftentimes think of political parties competing in national elections. So I think our understanding is that they compete in national elections and they're trying to win these. But we oftentimes forget about the different levels of aggregation. That these parties also compete at regional elections in the provinces and local elections in districts. And part of my research showed that these political parties act in sometimes very different ways at the provincial level than they do at the national level. Mm-hmm. And so they have a different set of strategies on the national level than they do at the regional level.